Hey, I'm Ron Drotos from keyboardimprov.com, and welcome to our 10th piano myth-busting video where we're taking these things you hear, you have to do this, you have to start like this is the only way to do it, and we're just letting it dissolve into the ether, as it were. These things don't apply to everybody. They don't apply to most people, and who knows? You know, you might find your own way from this, and that's really the point of it all. So this myth says that, quote, when you want to learn how to play jazz, you have to start with the blues. It's interesting because I never heard this growing up. It never even occurred to me. My friends were into jazz and they said, here's the real book, here's what Autumn Leaves looks like, here are the chords. And I'm like, okay, let's see, A minor 7, D7, and my friend who played guitar and could play at light speed at age 15 goes, 1, 2, 1. I'm like, oh. So I went home and I learned Autumn Leaves, you know, and then I gradually learned how to solo on it. And then occasionally you get into a blues or something like that. But no. It is true that the roots of jazz are largely the blues. Not all the blues, but you know, you hear classic blues. And back in the late 1800s, when jazz was invented, 1895, 1898, somewhere in there in New Orleans, part of it was the blues. They would take blues, and Buddy Bolden, one of his innovations, was to take blues and play it in a dance hall. So yeah, it wasn't just sung, but it was played for dancing, and they would play it with trumpets and different instruments, and that led to jazz. But it was also marching band music, ragtime, classical. U.B. Blake, the great jazz pianist from the early days, said that operetta, Victor Herbert's music, his operettas were a big influence on early jazz musicians. They played classical too. So there's a lot of different influences on the early jazz. So the blues is not the only one. It's a big part of it, but it's not the only one. And even today, we can get to jazz from any avenue you like. And I think the best way to start jazz is with what you like. It's really interesting because I get this question once in a while. People say, do I have to play blues before I play jazz? Sometimes if somebody subscribes to my video course, you know, they'll see there's all these intro to jazz, jazz standard workouts, things like that. But then they'll also see classic blues and New Orleans styles or rock and blues basics. And they'll email me saying, a little confused because I like jazz and I wanted to start your jazz stuff, but I've heard that we have to start with blues. Which do I do? Sometimes I'll say do both at the same time, but the real answer to this is any way you like to start jazz, that's the way you start jazz. And it may lead you to the blues sooner or later. Probably will at some point, right? Because if you're learning how to play, you know, straight no chaser, you know, you have to start learning the blues to do that. You can learn it through jazz, not necessarily as a prerequisite. So let's take a style of kind of jazz that is not particularly bluesy. And let's say that you really like it. I'm thinking of bossa nova, great Brazilian music, right? Not particularly bluesy on the surface. You know, you hear... So you love bossa novas. And you say, oh, I like to do that. And I heard the chords are jazzy, so I want to get into jazz. Well, those are the chords to Wave by Antonio Carlos Jobim. Well, you might be playing, you know, you might go through a few tunes, right? And you get to Wave, and you say, okay, well, I like this melody. Oh, it's got this beautiful diminished chord. Then it comes to this. And then it has this D minor. So that's a blues scale. It's the D blues scale in a bossa nova. And then you say, oh, and after that, this little vamp is D minor to G. So I can improvise with that blues scale on it. And then go back to the melody. So that's an example how just getting into jazz in the way that you like, the music that inspired you to want to learn it in the first place. Instead of putting it aside for 3 years while you're working on the blues until you're good enough to start jazz, you start with those tunes. And they will lead you to the blues because the blues is in jazz. It permeates the whole thing. So it's a win-win situation. You want to reward your enthusiasm But maybe a different way of putting it, you want to ride your enthusiasm, right? You want to ride your enthusiasm and let that sort of branch out into these different styles, including the blues. So there you go. You do not have to start with the blues to play jazz. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next piano myth busting video. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Whether you started with blues and found that helpful, or maybe you didn't, or maybe you don't even like blues, but you like jazz. I don't know, whatever it is. Let's support one another and get some conversation going. Thanks, and you take care.